He ghosted me without a word, vanishing like I was nothing. So when I found out he'd landed a big job interview, the one he'd bragged about for months, I made sure to ghost him right back, but with a twist. I reached out to his soon-to-be boss and casually mentioned how unreliable he could be, how he had a habit of disappearing when it mattered most. By the time he walked into that interview, his perfect introduction was already ruined. Call it payback or pettiness, I just call it closure. It all started on a breezy September night, the kind of evening that holds just enough chill to remind you that summer is slipping away but still clings to the remnants of warmth, as if reluctant to let go. The city lights flickered across wet pavement, rain having just passed, and the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby street vendor mingled with the crispness of the air, a scent that would later become a strange, involuntary trigger for the beginning of everything. I was at a rooftop birthday party I hadn't even wanted to attend, dragging myself there because my friend Lila had insisted that I really needed to get out and meet someone, though I hadn't believed her. My heart was still tender from a previous almost love, and I wasn't exactly in the mood for shallow small talk or the draining energy of strangers. But fate, or coincidence, or whatever it is that makes people collide at precisely the right or wrong moment, had other plans because that's where I met Ethan. Tall, confident without being arrogant, the kind of guy whose smile looked like it had a story behind it, a little crooked, a little guarded, but intensely charming. And when he offered me the last mini taco from a silver tray with a mock formal bow and said, "I believe this belongs to you, my queen," I laughed despite myself, despite the wall I had carefully built around my softness, and I said thank you, thinking it would end there. But it didn't. We ended up talking for what felt like hours, tucked into a corner by the fairy-lit railing far from the DJ's booming bass, sipping watered-down cocktails and trading snarky observations about the other guests. I learned that he worked in finance but hated it, that he'd been raised by a single mom in Boston, that he used to play guitar in a band that almost got signed, and that he still kept the instrument under his bed just in case. I told him I was a freelance writer, technically unemployed at the time, and that I loved tragic poetry and expensive candles and movies that made me cry, and he didn't flinch, didn't laugh, didn't ask if I had a real job. Instead, he asked what my favorite Sylvia Plath poem was, and when I told him, he quoted the first line from memory. I should have known right then that he was dangerous, but all I saw in that moment was magic, the kind that makes you believe you've finally met someone who understands the strange rhythm of your soul. After the party, he walked me to my car, and when we reached it, he didn't lean in for a kiss, didn't make it awkward or rushed. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, smiling like he knew a secret, and said, "Text me when you get home, yeah?" And I did, and that simple message turned into a night-long conversation that lasted until the birds began to sing. For the next few weeks, we were inseparable, not in the dramatic, obsessive way, but in the kind of way where it just made sense to spend time together. Brunches on Sundays, walks through the park with coffee in hand, long phone calls at midnight where we talked about everything and nothing, and I found myself falling fast and deep, and for once I didn't try to stop it. He was attentive, sweet, affectionate in small, thoughtful ways. The kind of guy who remembered what I said in passing and brought it up days later, who made playlists for me, who brought me flowers just because. And when he kissed me, it felt like the answer to a question I didn't know I'd been asking. It felt safe, like home, like maybe this time it would be different, maybe this time I wouldn't be the one left wondering what I did wrong. For a while I lived in that illusion, wrapped in it like a blanket, letting it dull the voice in the back of my head that whispered, "Be careful," because there were small signs, little cracks I chose to ignore. The way he always avoided introducing me to his friends, the mysterious phone calls he'd take in the other room, the times he'd go quiet for a day or two and then come back with vague apologies. But love, or something close enough, makes you blind, or maybe it just makes you willing to pretend you can't see. I remember the exact moment I realized I was in too deep. We were lying on my couch, my head on his chest, listening to an old Coldplay album, and he said, "Sometimes I think you might be the only person who really sees me," and I believed him. God help me, I believed him like it was scripture. But that perfect beginning, those honeyed words and soft gestures, wasn't a foundation, it was a stage, and I didn't yet know the script I was walking into, didn't know. I was being set up for an exit so silent, so cruel, it would leave me questioning every moment that came before. Because one day, just like that, he was gone. No call, no text, no explanation, just gone. Messages left on read, voicemails unanswered, mutual friends as confused as I was, or pretending to be, and suddenly I wasn't someone's maybe, someone's future, I was just someone he used to talk to, It was like being erased while still breathing, like screaming into a room full of people with no one looking up. I spiraled, not just from the heartbreak but from the sheer confusion of it. How does someone who holds your face like your art one day vanish without a word the next? I cried, of course I did. I blamed myself, questioned my worth, combed through every interaction looking for clues, wondering if I had said too much, asked too little, loved too hard. I spent weeks in that place, raw, humiliated, broken. But pain has a way of sharpening you, of boiling away the softness until only steel remains. And when I finally stopped asking why, and started asking, how do I make him regret it? Everything changed, because the universe, in its wicked generosity, gave me a gift. A whispered piece of gossip from a friend, casually mentioned over drinks. Ethan had a final round interview coming up, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity at a prestigious firm, something he'd apparently been working toward for months. And here's where things get interesting. My cousin worked in HR at that firm, in the exact department that would be handling the candidate screening process. It felt like the stars were aligning, not to bless me but to arm me, to give me the kind of poetic opportunity that only exists in fiction or fever dreams. Suddenly, I wasn't a woman scorned, I was a woman with a plan. It didn't happen with a fight or a final dramatic phone call filled with accusations and tears like you see in the movies. Instead, it was a silence so complete, so surgically executed, that I couldn't tell if I was being ghosted or just forgotten in a moment of chaos. At first, it was just a few unread messages, a missed phone call, and then the hours turned into a day, then two, and I told myself he was probably busy. Maybe a family emergency, maybe his phone had broken, maybe. But deep down, in the part of me that still remembers childhood disappointments and birthdays spent waiting on people who never showed up, I knew Ethan was gone. Not dead, not in danger, just absent, intentionally so. And the worst part wasn't the disappearance itself. It was the way he vanished, without warning, without closure, without even the decency of a lazy excuse. It was like I'd been deleted from his life, erased, as if the hours we spent wrapped around each other on lazy Saturday mornings had never happened, as if the stories he whispered into my hair about his childhood and dreams and fears were nothing but fiction. As if every kiss and every laugh and every moment of honesty was part of some rehearsed performance he'd done 100 times before with 100 different girls. I waited, God, I waited, for some kind of explanation, some flicker of humanity that would tell me this wasn't what it looked like, that I hadn't just been discarded like a used tissue, but nothing came, not a single word, not a breadcrumb of remorse or regret or respect. And the longer the silence stretched, the louder my mind became, filling in the gaps with worst-case scenarios and self-blame, turning over every interaction with forensic precision, wondering what I had done to deserve this kind of ending. Was it the time I asked about his ex? The moment I told him I loved him too soon? The weekend I cried in front of him after a fight with my sister? I replayed it all like a crime scene, trying to find the exact second when he decided I wasn't worth the courtesy of goodbye. My friends tried to help, offering clichés like, "You dodged a bullet, and it's his loss." But nothing felt worse than the hollow ache of being left behind without answers, of being made to feel foolish for believing, for trusting, for loving. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus. My brain was a loop of confusion and shame, a carousel of questions with no resolution. And the worst part was that I couldn't even grieve properly, because how do you mourn someone who's still alive, still posting gym selfies on Instagram, still liking memes about mental health and good vibes only, while you're breaking quietly in the dark? It felt like a slap, a personal humiliation broadcast through his silence, and still I said nothing, did nothing, held on to a shred of dignity even as I was being emotionally starved. Eventually I stopped texting, not because I no longer cared, but because there's only so many times you can talk to a wall before you realize the echo is the only thing responding. And slowly, begrudgingly, I began to move forward, if not on, returning to my routines like a ghost of myself, showing up to work with fake smiles, nodding at brunch conversations I barely heard, pretending I wasn't unraveling from the inside out. But here's the truth about being ghosted. It doesn't just hurt because someone left. It hurts because they made you feel invisible, worthless, forgettable, and that kind of damage doesn't fade overnight. It lingers, staining your thoughts, making you question your worth in every interaction that follows. It makes you paranoid, makes you cold, makes you angry. And that anger, that burn just beneath my ribs, that slow-growing ember of betrayal became the fuel I didn't know I needed. Because one night as I was scrolling through LinkedIn at 2 a.m., trying to distract myself with job listings and career success stories, I saw his profile. Ethan Collins, finance strategy consultant, freshly updated, polished, and, of course, marked with an open to work banner. And there's a moment in every betrayal when the illusion shatters, when the version of the person you've held onto in your heart collides violently with reality, and you're left staring into the wreckage wondering how you didn't see it sooner. For me, that moment came not with a confession, not with some dramatic confrontation, but through a series of carefully unraveled truths, truths that clawed their way into the light like something feral and long buried. And when I finally saw Ethan for what he was, the devastation wasn't just emotional, it was existential. Because it wasn't just that he had ghosted me or that he had lied about why. It was that everything, every word, every kiss, every lingering glance had been part of a larger performance, a carefully managed manipulation that he'd repeated with other women before me. And I realized likely after, the Ethan I knew, the Ethan I trusted, the Ethan who held my hand in bookstores and whispered poetry in bed, he wasn't real, not fully. He was a version, a mask, a construct designed to charm and consume and then disappear without consequence. And when I began to uncover that truth piece by piece, I felt like I was peeling back layers of my own identity along with his, questioning not just who he was but who I had become in his shadow. It started with the HR files. When Tara, after some coaxing, let me peek into the back end of the candidate review system, not to sabotage but just to see, to understand. And there it was. His resume, his references, the glowing cover letter full of ambitions and values, and lines that sounded eerily familiar because he had once said them to me verbatim on a rainy night in my kitchen while we drank wine and talked about the future like it was ours to build together. Seeing those words recycled, copied, and pasted into a job application like a rehearsed sales pitch made my stomach turn. But what made it worse, what drove the knife in deeper, was that one of his listed references was a woman named Julia W. And something about the name stuck in my brain like a splinter until I remembered. Julia was the girl he'd once vaguely referred to as my last big heartbreak, the one he said taught him a lot about who he didn't want to be. And here she was, still in his life, still doing him favors, still on the hook long after he claimed to be over her. So I did what any woman with a grudge and an internet connection would do. I found her. And when I reached out, I expected coldness or distance or confusion. But what I got instead was a 2-hour phone call that left me shaken to the core. Because Julia wasn't just a name on a resume, she was a mirror of my own experience, a ghosted girl turned survivor. And as she told me her story, with all its eerie similarities, the love bombing, the vanishing, the careful grooming of emotions, I realized I wasn't special, I wasn't the exception, I was just another chapter in his cycle of damage. And she wasn't the only one. Oh no, Julia was just the beginning. With her help, I connected with 2 more women, then 5, then 9, each of them with stories like mine, timelines that overlapped, gifts and promises and lies so identical it was as if we were all playing the same role in the same sick drama. Some of them cried, some of them were angry, some were still holding on to hope that maybe they had misunderstood. But I didn't misunderstand anymore. I saw him clearly now, not as the charming, mysterious man who had once looked at me like I hung the stars, but as a manipulator, a user, a man so emotionally vacant that he crafted his identity around seduction and escape. The truth was ugly, not just because of what he did but because of what I had let myself believe, the way I had edited out red flags in favor of romantic narratives, the way I had silenced my intuition because I wanted the story to be beautiful, because I wanted love to look like it did in the movies. But love doesn't lie, love doesn't vanish, love doesn't weaponize silence as a way to avoid accountability. And once I accepted that, once I truly knew that the man, it hit me like a slap that not only was he fine, he was thriving, preparing for the next big step in his life while I was still crawling out of the emotional crater he left behind. And then the universe did what it rarely does. It handed me a gift wrapped in poetic irony. When I clicked on a company he'd liked on LinkedIn and saw a mutual connection. My cousin Tara, who worked in HR at that exact firm, the one he was interviewing for, the one he'd once told me was his dream job back. When he still shared dreams with me, suddenly everything shifted. The pain didn't disappear, but it sharpened, focused, crystallized into a dangerous kind of clarity, and I knew without hesitation that this wasn't just coincidence. This was the moment the story flipped, the point where I stopped being the girl who got ghosted and became the ghost in his machine. I wasn't going to scream or beg, or chase closure he never planned to give. I was going to haunt him quietly and methodically in the exact way he deserved. And it started with a single text to Tara. Casual, innocent, "Hey, I saw your company is hiring. Got time to talk?" And the rest, well, let's just say things began to fall into place exactly the way I needed them to. It hit me like a slap that not only was he fine, he was thriving, preparing for the next big step in his life while I was still crawling out of the emotional crater he left behind. And then the universe did what it rarely does. It handed me a gift wrapped in poetic irony. When I clicked on a company he'd liked on LinkedIn and saw a mutual connection. My cousin Tara, who worked in HR at that exact firm, the one he was interviewing for, the one he'd once told me was his dream job back. When he still shared dreams with me, suddenly everything shifted. The pain didn't disappear, but it sharpened, focused, crystallized into a dangerous kind of clarity, and I knew without hesitation that this wasn't just coincidence. This was the moment the story flipped, the point where I stopped being the girl who got ghosted and became the ghost in his machine. I wasn't going to scream or beg, or chase closure he never planned to give. I was going to haunt him quietly and methodically in the exact way he deserved. And it started with a single text to Tara. Casual, innocent, "Hey, I saw your company is hiring. Got time to talk?" And the rest, well, let's just say things began to fall into place exactly the way I needed them to. I had loved was not capable of the kind of honesty or depth I had believed in. Something inside me broke free. The morning ended, the fog lifted, and in its place came a cold, bright clarity, the kind that demands justice not just for me but for every woman he left in ruins. I didn't want revenge for pain's sake. I wanted balance, correction. I wanted to be the reason he finally had to face himself, to stand in a room and answer for the destruction he left in his wake like emotional shrapnel. And as I pieced together his trail of broken hearts, I realized I held power. Not petty, vindictive power, but real, impactful leverage that could make a difference, that could not only stop him from getting the job he wanted but expose him to the very people he had fooled, the ones who only saw the polished LinkedIn profile and charming smile. Because what none of them knew, and what I now had documented proof of, was that Ethan's consulting work included fabrications, plagiarized presentations, and at least one accusation of inappropriate conduct from a former female coworker who, like so many of us, had stayed silent to avoid being labeled dramatic. I had it all now: emails, screenshots, timelines, testimonials, and I compiled it not with rage but with precision, like building a case file for a trial that no one else had the courage to prosecute. And then I did something even I didn't expect. I scheduled a meeting with Tara's supervisor, not to gossip, not to accuse, but to discuss a concern about a candidate. And when I laid out the documents and walked them through the pattern of behavior, the falsehoods, the red flags, there was silence, then concern, then action. Because companies can forgive a lot, but they do not forgive lies, especially when they come wrapped in charm and forged data. And when the day of his big interview arrived, I didn't gloat, I didn't stalk the building or send a dramatic message. I simply waited, knowing that he would walk into that office expecting applause and walk out to nothing but quiet rejection. And he did. He reached out to me finally a week later, not with apologies but confusion, a single text that said, "Did you do something?" And I stared at that message for a long time, feeling nothing. Not guilt, not pity, not triumph, just stillness. And then I replied with the only truth he was ever going to get from me. "No. You did." Brighter on what he'd done. And still I wasn't done, because visibility wasn't enough. Not for him, not for the job he would eventually chase next, not for the people he would lie to again. I wanted something unshakable, permanent, so I took it a step further. I gathered every testimony I had collected from the women who came forward and compiled them into a formal dossier. Not a hate file, not a character assassination, but a detailed, factual, well-documented portrait of a man whose pattern of behavior could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. I had timelines, voice memos, chat logs, blurred images, third-party confirmations, everything a hiring board or professional screening body would need to reconsider someone's integrity. And then I did the most calculated thing I'd ever done. I sent it not to destroy him but to warn them, to tell the truth in a way that couldn't be ignored or minimized, because what these companies didn't know could hurt people, and if no one was going to say it, I would. And when he found out, because of course he found out, he messaged me not with threats or apologies, but with a cold, hollow fury that revealed everything I had long suspected. "You think you're righteous? You think exposing me makes you better?" And that's when I realized he still didn't get it, still saw himself as the victim, still couldn't see past the idea that consequences weren't attacks, that truth wasn't revenge. So I didn't answer, didn't bite, didn't let him spin me into his narrative again. I blocked him, deleted the thread, and returned to my work, to my healing, to the plan that was no longer about him but about reclaiming everything he thought he could steal. My voice, my sanity, my power. It started with an instinct, that cold, intuitive twist in my gut that told me what I already feared. There was more than what I had seen, more than what I had lived, more than what even the other women had told me, because people like Ethan don't just lie in the present, they bury their past in layers of curated silence. And the more I pulled at the threads of his story, the more I realized how much he had managed to erase from the world's view. I told myself it wasn't obsession, that it wasn't me going crazy, even though that's exactly the kind of label men like him love to pin on women who dare to look too closely. It was something else, something rooted in truth-seeking, in a need to uncover not just the man who ghosted me but the man he had always been, long before he ever walked into my life with a crooked smile and a false future. So I began my own kind of excavation, digital at first, scrolling backward through his old posts, archived stories, tagged photos that he had tried to hide but never fully deleted, clues buried in outdated hashtags, university forums, mutual friends' memories, each one another grain of evidence in the sandcastle of his curated image. And the more I uncovered, the darker it became. There were photos of him with a woman he never mentioned, a brunette with soft eyes and a quiet presence in the background of his old college Facebook albums. And something about her struck me as familiar, not because I knew her, but because she looked like me, or at least the kind of version of me he seemed to chase. Quiet, trusting, creative. It took hours of tracing, following usernames, finding overlaps in location data and friends lists, but I eventually found her name, Samantha D. And when I reached out, I didn't expect her to reply, but she did, and when she answered my message with a simple, "I was wondering when someone would ask about him," I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about years of deception, a pattern older than I realized, and Samantha, once she was ready to talk, told me stories that made my skin crawl. How he had moved in with her, promised her the world, then drained her emotionally and financially before walking out without a word, taking with him a laptop she had bought for their shared future. How she had filed a police report not for theft but for safety, because after he left, strange things started happening. Missed packages, locks tampered with, mutual friends turning cold without explanation. It was more than ghosting, it was manipulation turned psychological warfare. And when I asked her why she hadn't spoken up sooner, she said, "Because when I tried, no one believed me. He made me out to be unstable, dramatic, jealous." And hearing that, something inside me hardened further, because I had felt those labels hanging over me too, even when I hadn't heard them spoken, felt them press into my chest in the form of subtle doubts and eye rolls from others, the way society still reflexively asks, what did she do to push him away? Instead of what did he do to disappear so cleanly? But I wasn't going to be quiet, and neither was Samantha, not anymore. We shared our files, compared notes, created a timeline that stretched farther than I thought possible, overlapping women, jobs, friendships lost, financial red flags, and then something else surfaced. Something darker. Through one of the aliases he'd used for online freelancing work, we traced him to a digital forum, one cloaked in the guise of male self-improvement, but steeped in toxic rhetoric, posts about soft women and emotional leverage, strategies to extract validation while avoiding commitment, advice from men to men on how to disengage cleanly after they'd gotten what they needed. And buried among the usernames, carefully disguised, was one that matched Ethan's side gig email, a throwaway account he used for job hunting and, apparently, emotional manipulation tutorials. Reading his posts was like walking through a graveyard of empathy, cold, calculated, disturbingly self-aware. Because it wasn't just that he didn't care, it was that he had studied how to hurt, refined it, shared it, and the ugliest truth wasn't just that he ghosted women, it was that he trained others how to do it too. I documented everything, saved every screenshot, every comment thread, every matching metadata point, and at that moment I realized what I was doing wasn't just a personal mission, it was a social one. Ethan Collins wasn't a tragic dating story, he was a functioning predator operating under the radar of charm, privilege, and plausible deniability, and if I didn't bring it to light, who would? So I widened the net. More women, more forums, a private digital group created by me and Samantha where others could share their stories safely, away from shame and fear, and what came out of it was staggering. Not just hurt, but patterns. The same lies repeated, the same setups, the same cycle of praise, withdrawal, discard. He hadn't changed, not in a decade, not through jobs or cities or partners. And yet the world kept rewarding him, believing him, falling for him, and I had had enough. I was digging not for gossip but for truth, the kind of truth that couldn't be ignored, the kind that could survive scrutiny, and by the end of that month I had built a master file. Dozens of pages, timelines, testimonies, screen recordings, psychological evaluations from women who had gone to therapy because of him, and even one anonymous report from a former coworker who confessed that Ethan had once stalked her after she rejected him at a holiday party. This wasn't heartbreak anymore, this was a pattern of targeted emotional abuse dressed in tailored suits and Instagram smiles. And I was no longer afraid of being labeled vindictive or bitter, because if digging for dirt meant unearthing the truth, then I would dig until the whole world could see what lay beneath the mask he wore so well. They say timing is everything. Comedy, tragedy, justice, revenge. They all depend on the moment the curtain rises, and I had learned, over countless nights of sleepless planning and quiet rage, that nothing in this world could be more powerful than knowing when to strike. All the evidence I had collected, all the stories, screenshots, testimonies, confessions, they were arrows in a quiver I had refused to fire too early, because I understood something Ethan never did. Power isn't in the act, it's in the patience, in the restraint, in the quiet knowing that your move will land when the ground beneath them is already cracked, when they're at their most sure of themselves, when they think they've escaped. Because that's when the truth hits hardest. I watched him from a distance, not obsessively but surgically, with the cool gaze of someone who no longer burned, who no longer ached, who had replaced grief with purpose and sadness with structure. He had resurfaced, of course, with a new job application trail, a new set of smiles, a new collection of curated content that made him look like a reformed, stable, clean-cut man who'd simply had a few unlucky breaks. And once again the world was ready to believe him, because men like Ethan are designed to be believed. Articulate, attractive, charming in just the right measure of vulnerability, the kind of man who admits to mistakes, just enough to seem human but never enough to seem dangerous. I saw him reposting motivational quotes, liking job-related posts, networking with CEOs on LinkedIn as if nothing had ever happened, as if dozens of women hadn't sat in their bedrooms staring at red receipts from him that never came with closure. And then he landed an opportunity, not just any job but the job, a high-profile executive role at a startup with buzz, prestige, media attention, and just enough forward-facing publicity to finally expose him to the level of scrutiny I had been waiting for. I didn't rush. I watched, listened, gathered, built a timeline that aligned not just with his professional moves but with the media cycles, internal review processes, and decision-making windows of the company he was trying to charm. I researched the founders, the HR lead, the board of directors, their values, their stance on integrity, harassment, accountability, and public trust. And once I had all the pieces, I waited until the perfect window, 48 hours, before the final board interview, just after his background check had cleared, just before his contract would be drafted, and then I moved. I composed an email, not angry, not dramatic, but precise, clinical, fact-checked, and supported by time-stamped documentation. And I sent it not just to HR but to the CEO, the head of investor relations, and the lead woman on the company's new diversity and ethics committee, because I understood that silence speaks to power but evidence shakes it. And then I did something even colder. I didn't watch. I didn't refresh. I didn't wait for a reply. I went to brunch with friends, put my phone on silent, smiled, laughed, let the weight of years lift from my chest, because the truth no longer belonged to me. It belonged to them now, and it was their move to make. The response came in quiet, professional ripples. A scheduled phone call from the company's ethics officer, a polite yet nervous conversation, a request for permission to share the dossier with legal, a thank you note wrapped in concern and subtle horror. And within 36 hours the offer was rescinded, the position was closed, and the internal communications memo leaked, anonymously, on a startup watchdog blog that featured a careful, redacted version of the file I had submitted. Suddenly Ethan wasn't just facing rejection, he was facing exposure, the kind that couldn't be explained away with charm or Instagram quotes, the kind that left footprints online and questions in boardrooms and phone calls from recruiters that suddenly went unanswered. And still I didn't post about it, didn't claim it, didn't tell the world what I had done, because the most powerful kind of justice is the one that doesn't beg for applause. It's the one that rearranges your name in the minds of those who doubted you, that quiets the whispers with facts, that creates consequences, real ones, without screaming for credit. And when Ethan finally messaged me, because of course he did, because people like him always think they deserve answers, he didn't ask, "Why did you do this?" He asked, "How could you do this to me?" And in that moment, every doubt I had ever held, every flicker of guilt or fear, vanished like ash in the wind. I didn't reply. Not then, not ever. Because I understood now that justice doesn't need to speak when the truth is loud enough to echo. The perfect timing wasn't just about when to act. It was about when to let go, when to stop waiting for closure from someone incapable of giving it, when to stop bleeding for a man who never deserved to be your wound in the first place. The thing about sabotage, the real kind, not the impulsive, angry flailing of someone wounded, but the kind that's precise, orchestrated, long brewing like a storm planned down to the second, is that it doesn't look like chaos from the outside. It looks like a coincidence, a ripple, a sudden shift in the air, and that's exactly how I wanted it to feel for Ethan. Not like someone had attacked him, but like the life he'd built on lies had finally turned on him, quietly and completely. Because sabotage isn't about rage, it's about control, and after all the damage he'd left behind, after the ghosting, the gaslighting, the manipulation, the hollow apologies that came too late, I wasn't interested in yelling or demanding anything from him anymore. I was interested in pulling the right threads and watching the entire mask unravel in real time, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the truth. And so I began not with Ethan directly but with what mattered most to him. His image, his upward climb, the thin veneer of success he depended on to keep getting what he wanted from the world. While he posed for filtered selfies and reposted industry platitudes about leadership and authenticity, I mapped out his network. Colleagues, mentors, ex-managers, freelance clients he'd underdelivered for but somehow kept in his back pocket through charm. And slowly, surgically, I began to undercut the very foundation he stood on. I contacted a former business partner of his, someone I knew from LinkedIn had worked with him on a project that ended abruptly, someone who'd posted vague complaints about being burned by trusting the wrong people. And I reached out carefully, not with accusations but with questions. What happened between you and Ethan? Did he deliver what he promised? And when the floodgates opened, I learned that Ethan hadn't just ghosted girlfriends, he had ghosted entire projects, leaving clients on the hook, dropping deadlines, disappearing after payments had cleared, and worse, he'd often blamed others, shifting responsibility just enough to escape consequences while tarnishing the reputations of people who couldn't afford to speak up. With permission, I gathered their emails, statements, testimonials, stories of misused funds, unfulfilled contracts, toxic behavior masked as stress under pressure. And I compiled it into something solid, something bigger than a breakup story, something that looked and read like a professional risk profile, the kind that startups, recruiters, and investors would be wary of if it landed in their inbox or across their boardroom table. And then I did something even colder. I created a dossier, not anonymous this time, but professionally formatted, sourced, cross-referenced, complete with verifiable footnotes and supporting links. And I sent it not only to every company he had recently applied to, but to a quiet network of HR leaders and recruiters I'd built through my own connections, women and allies who cared about ethical vetting and were sick of seeing charismatic abusers slip through the cracks of shiny resumes and confident handshakes. I wasn't slandering, I was informing, and every word was backed with documentation, real voices, real stories. The truth served not as revenge but as a record that no one could pretend they hadn't seen. And then the shift began, not dramatic, not overnight, but subtle and steady. Interview invites dried up, collaborations were paused, people who once commented, "You're killing it," on his posts now stayed silent, and though he still smiled in photos I could see it, the panic in his eyes, the cracks forming beneath the digital surface of his curated brand. He posted more often, clinging to motivational content, trying to overcompensate, and then one day he went quiet altogether, his account suddenly inactive, his online presence reduced to a ghost. And I knew. The sabotage had landed not as fire but as rot, a silent undoing that came from within. But I wasn't done, because while his professional world was collapsing, there was still the personal one, the one be used like a pipeline to refill his ego, to find new women, new sources of admiration and validation. And that's when I made the boldest move of all. I created a private community, a space for women in my city to share anonymous red flag stories, and I seeded it with my own, carefully disguised but deeply familiar, and it didn't take long before others began to describe a man just like him, sometimes with different names, sometimes with the same stories. The love bombing, the sudden coldness, the cycle of intense affection followed by silence, the borrowed money, the shared Spotify playlists that he reused like scripts. And once the patterns were undeniable, we shared knowledge. Not to attack, but to protect, to warn, to remind each other that we weren't crazy, we weren't imagining the damage. We had been preyed on, but we were no longer powerless. And in that act of shared sabotage, not against one man but against a culture that let men like him thrive, we found not only justice but healing. And when the whispers finally reached him, because of course they did, because men like Ethan always have ears everywhere, he tried to post a video. Shaky, poorly lit, an attempt to reclaim his voice, a tired speech about being misunderstood, and taking accountability for the past without ever admitting a single wrong, and the comments were brutal, not because we asked people to attack but because no one bought the act anymore. The performance was stale, the charm expired, and when he logged off that final time, when his name stopped appearing in job listings and his number stopped showing up in group chats, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean, like the final piece had fallen into place exactly when and where it was supposed to, and the sabotage, slow and invisible to him until it was too late, had done what no confrontation ever could. It had erased his power, his ability to continue, not just with me but with anyone else who might have stood where I once stood, heart in hand, waiting for a ghost to speak. Fallout doesn't come all at once. It unfolds in fragments, in whispers, in the subtle collapse of systems that once felt solid. And that's exactly how it began after Ethan's carefully curated empire of charm and deceit crumbled under the weight of everything he thought he'd buried. At first, it was digital. His online presence fading from consistent, curated activity into long stretches of silence, his once smooth comments on startup founder posts vanishing, leaving behind only the echoes of deleted profiles and unanswered tags. Then it bled into the professional world, and the whispers started moving faster than I expected. Recruiters ghosted him, old colleagues stopped returning his calls, and even the clients who used to defend his inconsistencies suddenly pulled back their endorsements, as if sensing something had changed in the ecosystem around him. He was still walking around, still breathing, still trying to maintain the illusion, but I could tell from the forced smiles in his last few selfies, from the tired tone in his motivational captions, that the fallout had reached him and it wasn't letting go. But the deeper truth was that I had changed too, not just because I'd watched his walls come down, but because something inside me had shifted, hardened, healed, and as the fallout spread, it didn't just land on him. It landed on me, on all the women who'd been part of this story, and the most surprising thing was that it wasn't only about Ethan anymore. It became something larger, something heavier, a wave of reckoning that brought other stories to the surface. Friends confiding about their own versions of Ethan, women messaging me in secret to say they'd been inspired to speak out, strangers asking how I had done it, how I'd stayed sane through it all, how I hadn't collapsed under the pressure of being the one to finally pull the thread that unraveled the lie. And honestly, I didn't always feel strong. I felt tired often and raw, like my nerves had been peeled back and exposed for too long, like I'd spent so much time hunting the truth that I forgot how to rest. But the solidarity, the sisterhood that bloomed from the ashes, it gave me something Ethan never could. Restoration, connection, a reminder that while one man may try to make you feel invisible, your story can still burn bright enough to guide others home. And while he scrambled to salvage his name, I started something new. I wrote more, I spoke publicly. I let my voice be heard, not as the girl who got ghosted, but as the woman who refused to be silent. And with every story I told, I reclaimed something he thought he could take forever. And the fallout kept coming. People who had defended him began to retreat, not always with apologies, but with silence, the kind that acknowledges guilt without naming it. A few tried to reach out, his former friends, one of his brothers, even his ex-manager who once told me I was too emotional when I raised concerns. But I didn't respond, not because I held grudges but because I no longer needed their validation to confirm the truth I already lived. And somewhere in the middle of that unraveling, I realized that the most unexpected part of the fallout was how it reshaped me. Not into someone bitter or broken, but into someone unshakable, someone who knew the sound of her own voice even in the dark. And still, there were moments, quiet, cruel moments, when I felt the ghost of what we once had flicker through my mind, and for a split second I remembered the version of Ethan I fell in love with, the man who played piano in the dark and said he believed in soulmates. But then I'd remember the silence that followed, the coldness, the deliberate erasure of my worth, and I'd come back to myself stronger, clearer, and more certain than ever that love without accountability is just manipulation dressed in romance. And the final blow? It wasn't even mine to deliver. It came from a woman I'd never met, someone who read one of my pieces online and realized the man she was currently seeing was Ethan. Different city, different job, same pattern. And when she confronted him, he tried to deny it, to spin the story, to suggest that I was unstable, that I was out to ruin him. And she told him with more courage than I ever had in those early days, "Then why are there dozens of us?" And she left, sent me a thank you message, and disappeared from his life like a final punctuation mark on a sentence that had gone on too long. I don't know where he is now. Not exactly, and I don't need to. Maybe he's licking his wounds. Maybe he's rebuilding, maybe he's sitting in a quiet room wondering how everything slipped through his fingers. But that's not my story anymore. My story is the fallout, yes, but it's also the rebuilding, the rising, the reclaiming of my own narrative from the mouth of someone who never deserved to hold it in the first place. And if there's one thing I've learned from this whole war of silence and sabotage, it's that the most powerful revenge isn't in the collapse of someone else. It's in the rebuilding of yourself so fully, so visibly, so unbreakably, that they no longer have the power to haunt you. Karma isn't always loud, and it rarely looks like revenge in the way we imagine it. No lightning bolt from the sky, no dramatic courtroom confession, no public downfall that goes viral in real time. It's slower, more patient, more poetic than that, and in Ethan's case, karma arrived not with a bang but with a sequence of quiet closures, one after another, until the life he built out of lies began to buckle beneath its own weight, until even he couldn't tell where the truth ended and his performance began. It started with silence. Emails not answered, interviews quietly cancelled, offers he thought were guaranteed suddenly gone without explanation. And I knew without having to ask that the seeds I planted had taken root, that the story had made its rounds through the kinds of circles where people whisper warnings more than they make public declarations, where reputation matters more than truth, and the absence of opportunity says more than any official statement ever could. But karma, in its quiet genius, didn't just strip Ethan of his future. It began to rewrite his past, to infect the very narrative he had spent years crafting, so that the stories he used to tell so convincingly no longer held up under scrutiny, so that old acquaintances began to question what they had once accepted at face value, so that his name, once associated with charm and promise, was now followed by hesitation, by a quiet pause, by the unspoken question: is this the guy they warned us about? And while all of that unfolded beyond my sight, the part of karma that mattered most was what unfolded inside of me. Not gloating, not triumph, but peace, deep and clear, like water that had finally stopped being stirred. Because I hadn't ruined his life. He had, and all I had done was make sure the truth had somewhere to land, somewhere to echo, somewhere to live outside of the silence he once forced upon me. And maybe the most poetic part of it all was how natural it felt to let go. Not because I forgave him, but because I no longer needed him to suffer for me to be free. I was free already, and his downfall wasn't my closure, it was just confirmation. But karma wasn't done yet, not entirely, because a few weeks after everything had gone quiet, I received a message from an unknown number, and against my better judgment I opened it, and there it was. Not a threat, not a plea, but a confession. Long, rambling, half-formed, like a man unraveling in real time, and though he never said the words, "I'm sorry," the guilt was there, buried beneath the blame, beneath the defensiveness, beneath the final gasp of a man watching the world he once controlled slip away. He wrote about how things had gotten out of hand, how he never meant to hurt anyone, how he felt misunderstood, and I didn't even need to finish reading it to know that it wasn't for me, it was for him, an attempt to rewrite the story one last time, to cast himself as the tragic anti-hero instead of the calculated deceiver he had been all along. But I didn't reply, not because I was cold, but because I had nothing left to say, and karma, in its perfect timing, had already spoken louder than I ever could. And after that, I deleted the message, blocked the number, and went back to my life. A life that no longer revolved around him or the version of me that once loved him, a life that had grown wider, richer, more vibrant in the absence of his shadow. I traveled, I spoke at events, I held space for other women to tell their stories, and each time I heard one, I felt the pulse of something bigger than pain. I felt legacy, transformation, a wildfire of voices no longer afraid to speak the truths they were once shamed into burying. And perhaps that was the truest karma of all. Not Ethan's fall, but our rise, collective and unstoppable, built not on vengeance but on truth. Because karma isn't punishment, it's correction, and sometimes that correction doesn't come in the form of a downfall, but in the form of a mirror held up so close that the person finally sees themselves clearly for the first time and can no longer. Healing doesn't arrive like a sunrise. It comes in tremors, in waves, in quiet moments where you catch yourself smiling and realize the pain has finally stopped echoing at full volume. And even though the sabotage had landed, even though karma had swept in with its quiet, devastating precision, what remained in the aftermath were not ruins, but fractures, small, permanent breaks in how I once viewed the world, the people in it, and most of all myself, because what Ethan did to me, what he did to all of us, didn't just vanish with his downfall. It left shadows, questions, a lingering doubt in the back of my mind every time I met someone new, every time I was offered affection or opportunity or promises that sounded too smooth, too polished, too familiar. And even though I was stronger now, louder, clearer, unapologetically myself in a way I'd never been before, there were still days when I felt like I was walking through a field of glass, cautious and sharp, aware of every step, and sometimes I hated that the cost of survival was a kind of vigilance I couldn't unlearn. But maybe that's the real legacy of betrayal. Not just the wound, but the wisdom, the hyper-awareness that comes with having seen the worst and having clawed your way back anyway. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fractures became part of the architecture, not flaws but reminders, like the gold veins in kintsugi pottery where broken things are repaired with beauty instead of shame. And in the spaces between the cracks, something new started to grow. A life that wasn't centered around loss but around learning, around reclaiming joy in tiny, unexpected ways. Dancing barefoot in my living room without wondering if someone was watching. Writing without wondering if my truth was too sharp. Waking up without checking my phone to see if I'd been abandoned again in digital silence. And then came the futures. The ones I hadn't dared to imagine before. The ones that felt impossible when I was still trapped in the cycle of hope and heartbreak, of almosts and ghostings and second-guessing my own memory. Because for so long, my future had felt like a fog, something I was supposed to chase without ever being able to see it clearly. But now, slowly, shape began to form. I began to trust again. Not blindly, not recklessly, but with the cautious hope of someone who knew exactly what it cost to be betrayed and who chose deliberately to believe in the possibility of something better anyway. I made new friends, deeper ones, women who had stood in their own fires and walked through them like warriors. And with them I laughed harder, cried less, and never had to explain why I double-checked everything, why I was slow to say yes, why I sometimes went quiet in rooms full of men who talked too much and listened too little. And love? Yes, it came, but not like lightning, not like a flood, not like a movie montage. It came like a sunrise I almost missed, slow, warm, careful, respectful, asking permission to stay, and I didn't rush it, didn't define it by how quickly it made me forget Ethan, because forgetting wasn't the goal. Transcending was. And somewhere in all of it I found peace with the fracture, with the fact that I would never be the same girl who once clung to a 3-word text message like it was a lifeline, who once waited for a call that would never come, who once molded herself into softness just to keep a man from slipping through her fingers. She was gone, but not lost, not destroyed. She had evolved, shed her naivety like old skin, and what remained was something fiercer, more grounded, more whole than I ever thought possible. And so I moved forward, not with a clean slate but with a full one, filled with pain, yes, but also with power, with stories, with a kind of knowing that could never be taken away from me again. And Ethan? He became a footnote, a cautionary tale, a name I no longer spoke aloud, not out of fear but because he no longer deserved the oxygen of my attention. His story had ended where mine began, and the future, fractured, healing, luminous, was finally mine to write. Look away, and I hope he did see, in the end, not just what he lost but what he destroyed, what he broke without consequence for so long. And I hope it keeps him awake at night, not because I wish him pain, but because I want him to understand what it costs to treat people like disposable chapters in your story. And if there's any justice in this world, it's that every time he tries to start again he'll remember, not me, not the revenge but the truth, the echo of all the women who finally stopped staying quiet, the ripple of accountability that found him when he thought he'd outrun it forever. And as for me, I no longer tell this story with the weight of sorrow or the heat of anger. I tell it like a survivor tells the tale of the fire that once tried to consume her, calmly, with clarity, knowing the flames never stood a chance in the end. He ghosted me, so I ghosted him right back, but not with silence. I showed up when it mattered most, His big job interview. One little truth, one whispered word in the right ear, and suddenly his perfect plans didn't look so perfect anymore. Some people say revenge is petty, but sometimes it's poetic. He vanished when I needed him, so I made sure his future did too. Funny how ghosts can haunt back. Would you like this type of continue? Don't take any action or efforts, just subscribe it.